You're listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Pooja Mehra.
Hello, I'm Pooja Mehra. Regardless of whether they lean ideologically to the left or the right, Indian politicians don't trust markets and try to control forces of demand and supply. The history of Coca-Cola in India is a great example for showing this is often the wrong approach. Coca-Cola entered India in 1956, just about a decade after independence. In 1977, the Industry Minister in Prime Minister Morarji Desai's government, George Fernandes, asked Coca-Cola to leave India. This was the first non-Congress party government. It was elected after the emergency. This new policy required foreign enterprises operating in India in non-priority sectors to reduce their equity to not more than 40% in their Indian subsidiaries. Coke had 100% equity in its India business. It was willing to transfer 60% of the shares of its Indian firm to a local partner as required, but Fernandes insisted that it also reveal the formula for its secret recipe to its Indian shareholders or else exit the country. Coke wound up its business in India and left. The workers of the Coke bottling plant in Delhi protested outside the official ministerial residence of George Fernandes and, according to some reports, stormed his car. He tried to explain to them that this was not going to take away any jobs, as Indian companies could take over Coke's business, even after it was to exit the country. Years later, Fernandes explained in an interview that the thought of asking Coke to leave India occurred to him when he was on a tour in a village, and on asking for a glass of water, an IAS officer instead offered the fizzy drink to him. It made him angry that in 30 years of independence, the country hadn't succeeded in supplying drinking water to villages, but Coke had managed to set up its supplies. India's private businesses, though, weren't as incompetent. Coca-Cola leaving India turned out to be a golden opportunity for Parle and its Thums Up. There were small regional competitors like Campa Cola as well. And believe it or not, the government also entered the cola business. The PSU that made modern bread started making a cola called Double 7. It must have failed at some point since we don't hear of it anymore. Thums Up, however, captured 70 to 80% of the market. In 1989, George Fernandes was back as a cabinet minister in the minority government of the Janata Dal Party. A proposal to allow Pepsi to enter the Indian cola market came up before the cabinet, which Fernandes opposed predictably. But he didn't find much support from his colleagues. Through the 6 to 8 months when Pepsi's entry was being considered in the cabinet, he ran a campaign against this outside government, finding no takers. The cabinet cleared the proposal. In 1991, the minority Congress government liberalized foreign investment policies, and in 1993, Coca-Cola re-entered the Indian market. Thums Up, by this time, had 80% of the market share, but was majorly dependent on its bottlers. Parle owned just about 4 of its 60-odd bottlers. To displace Thums Up, Coca-Cola started signing up its bottlers, and the battle turned quite ugly, after which Parle sold Thums Up to Coke. Coke tried to shelf Thums Up, although it has never accepted this, only to find Pepsi lapping up the Thums Up market share, which forced it to reintroduce Thums Up. Today, Thums Up is not only the largest cola in Coke's portfolio, but it is India's largest fizzy drink. The markets did a better job than the political Swadeshi agenda. All of the insecurities about Indian businesses losing out to foreign competition seem overblown, given Parle is in fact doing rather well, even though it had to sell Thums Up. Indian cola makers may well have been better placed if India had better functioning markets for capital and bottles, etc., when the battle for bottlers was taking place. The guest on today's show is R Srinivasan. Srini sir is a senior corporate and economic policy journalist who broke the news story of Coke buying Thums Up. He has worked in the Times of India, Mail Today, and was the editor of the Hindu Business Line. We don't talk enough about it, but the history of Coca-Cola in India demonstrates, doesn't it, how markets can easily do what governments try to do but fail. And in fact, Coca-Cola has probably learned a thing or two about markets from its India experience. But before we tell our listeners this story, let's start from the beginning. Let's talk about how Coca-Cola entered India in 1956, just about a decade after independence, and how it was a lucrative business for them. Then what happened in the 1970s, the two main characters in this story, and of course you're a third character as a journalist, who was a consumer of fizzy drinks, or probably still is. I'd given up fizzy drinks. But then, you played a role when you broke to the world the news of an important piece in this larger story. So let's start from the beginning when Coca-Cola first enters India.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, Coca-Cola, some of the brands that Ramesh Chauhan of Parle created very successfully in India, they're all very intricately connected. And the connection just didn't begin in 1993. Coca-Cola is the oldest soft drink brand marketed in India. I think it came to the country sometime in 1956. Around a year later, an orange flavored drink called Gold Spot was launched. Gold Spot was the oldest domestic soft drink brand. It was a fizzy colored sugary drink, pretty much the formula followed by all the MNCs for all their products. And it was extremely successful for many, many years. Coke had pretty much an undisputed run for some 4 decades in the country. They had about 85% of the market. The rest were like, nameless, small, local stuff, right? There were a few chota brands around, but none of them really had anything other than a very local or a sub-regional presence. This was the only national brand, and they had a pretty much an unfettered run. But a lot of things happened. So in 1976, as you know, the emergency was imposed, which led to a sort of major, I think the first major paradigm shift in our politics, because India was a sort of uniparty democracy for all intents and purposes for a long time. But emergency summarily changed that. And all these disparate political opposition parties came together in a bid to defeat Indira Gandhi. And when she called for elections in 1977, the Janata Party was formed, and the Janata Party managed to defeat Indira Gandhi. And you had the mother of all. It was not a coalition government in the strict sense of the term, but it was the mother of all coalitions. I mean, you had everybody there from the left parties to the extreme right-wing elements, the predecessor of the BJP, the Jan Sangh, the socialists. Everybody was in this one large umbrella organization called the Janata Party. Clearly, there were many, many ideological and policy differences within the ruling administration. But for a while, the more vocal of the minorities prevailed, shall I say. And so, although Morarji Desai was the head of the government, and he was from the Swatantra Party, which is actually in economic policy a little bit more right-wing than the BJP, But it was George Fernandez who was the industries minister, who wanted to sort of go back to the socialist era. And it sort of dovetailed with Morarji and some of the other members of that coalition's Swadeshi ideal. So you had Swadeshi on one side, and you had a socialist ideologue on the other side who wanted to sort of have the state control the commanding heights of the economy, in fact, everything in the economy. So, strangely enough, both of these two came together. So the government passed a law saying that all multinational companies should have 60% Indian shareholding, which Coke actually agreed to. They said they will form a joint venture with their bottlers and they would give 60% shareholding to them. But what George Fernandez further did, because Coke was seen as the sort of symbol of American imperialism, George Fernandez insisted that Coke should also part with its secret cola formula, right? And that it should be made in India. Coke refused and they walked out. So in 1977, Coca-Cola departed the country, and the soft drink cola market, many interesting things happened. So on the one side, Coca-Cola's principal bottler in the North region was a Sadaji called Charanjit Singh. And he basically concocted a cola of his own and called it Camper Cola. In fact, it was pretty good. I remember, just to digress, if you give me a minute, very interesting anecdote. Luciano Benetton came to India sometime around that time. And he came to Delhi and he took a stroll. He was staying in the Imperial or someplace. And he took a stroll around Janpat and he was quite surprised to see the extent of Benetton's presence on the Janpat footpaths. Okay, where there is a very famous export reject clothing, these footpath vendors. So he saw a lot of fake Benettons there. So he got so interested. Some of them are pretty good. So he got interested. And Benetton actually, just as a little stunt, they brought out a small book of the world's best and worst fakes, right? In different categories. India managed two entries in that list. The world's best fake cola was Campo Cola, according to Luciano Benetton. And he said the world's worst fake pizza was the Nirula Schema pizza, which he said, I don't know what it is, but, you know. So Capicola was a pretty decent substitute. Then the government came up with its own cola substitute, and it was called 7777. The symbol logo was a 27 interlinked sevens, numeral sevens, because it was released in the year 1977, and it was made by then PSU called Modern Food. A sort of bread making enterprise which the government had taken, because in those days, and if I'm not mistaken, even till now, basic bread is subsidized. It was considered part of the state. So they get government subsidy. And so they use some provision to take over modern at that time. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. So Coke exited the country. Number of these domestic, Campo Cola started operating. 77 started operating. And Ramesh Chauhan decided that here was a big chunk of market available to enter. And he came up with his own cola called Thums Up. So while almost all the colas, Coke, Pepsi, various variants, basically they use the extract of the cola nut as the base, Ramesh Chauhan basically used tea, black tea extract, and then he put in a lot of spices which are familiar to Indian, elaichi, cardamom, cinnamon, mace, stuff like that, and came up with something which actually sort of looked like and tasted pretty much like a cola, became very popular. And then, he was doing very well. He had managed to grab most of Coke's market share. Thums Up was the biggest cola brand in the country. Then the other rival American company, Pepsi, entered India. They accepted by that time, the political scenario had changed. So this thing of, everything being national owned had gone. But there were still a lot of restrictions on foreign companies. And Pepsi accepted those restrictions on shareholding, etc. And also, there was a very peculiar condition put on Pepsi that they cannot sell it as Pepsi. It has to be a sort of Indian brand. So they came up with this addition called Leher. So it was Leher Pepsi, Leher whatever, So that happened, but Pepsi sort of, managed to quickly win a fair amount of market share also from Thums Up.
Should we pause here and just discuss what it is that makes governments, that was making at that point governments take these decisions, like asking Coca-Cola to have an Indian partner, which it accepted, and only when it was asked to share its formula that it decided to leave India. And then later on, Pepsi came to India, I think, after the 1991 reforms, right?
Pepsi, I think, came to India in 1988. So it came to India before Coke returned.
But then asking them to have an Indian name, so that makes them change their name to Leher Pepsi only for Indian market. What were the governments trying to do by doing these things?
So, you must remember that, we were in the last stages of, I would say, the socialist planned development, this thing where the guiding principle was self-reliance and import substitution. Foreign exchange was scarce. Our export earnings were very, very limited. The country was even then paying a heavy price for oil imports after the first oil shock. The sort of guiding principle for government policy was that, look, let's try and make everything here if possible. Let's try and sort of substitute as many imported stuff as possible. The second was that, like I said, there was the self-reliance thing also coincided with the Swadeshi sort of push that a certain section of the political class was also gunning for. But I feel that it is primarily just typical bureaucratic micromanagement. That's That's something which hasn't changed. That, you may have reforms, you may say we are opening this and that, but the IAS never goes away. They make the minutiae of the rules. They ensure that interpretation is in their hands and it can be liberally interpreted any which way they choose. And therefore, they have discretionary decision-making powers, which means my Bap Sarkar stays forever, no matter what kind of reforms you do. So this was the thing. So this was all micromanaging things, insisting that you have a Indian brand. The same thing happened with Maruti Suzuki, right? It started as Maruti, then Suzuki came in, then and they insisted that the Indian brand should be retained. And it became a different matter that even after Suzuki acquired majority control of Maruti Suzuki. But by that time, the Maruti brand was so well known, they said, okay, let's just keep it here for the Indian market. So the company is still called Maruti Suzuki India Limited. And they used the brand on the cars for a long, long time after they had no legal need to do so. So those things happen. So these are lessons which markets teach you. But by and large, these are all government attempts to sort of direct every little way in which capital flows happen, where they went, how they should go, how much should happen. All this is controlled, and still is in some way or the other. So that I think it's a fallout of that more than any sort of very strong ideological or economic reasons.
Right. So then Pepsi comes to India in the 1980s.
Yes. So Pepsi returns, they do well. And then by that time, they sort of, they're working away with the government, they're lobbying, things like that. Policies change slowly. So Neher Pepsi is allowed to drop the Neher. It becomes Pepsi. Then Coke feels that, all right, this is the time to come back to India because conditions have changed. We can run our business the way we want to and not the way the government tells us to. So they came back, but the market was much tougher than when they left. So you had Pepsi, which was an American rival who knew their playbook very well and which also had deep pockets. In addition, you had a very well entrenched domestic player in the form of Ramesh Chauhan and Parle. So Coke initially, came in. What they started was, and then they started basically dirty tricks. Okay. What they did was they said, we can't take on Ramesh Chauhan, so let's steal his bottlers and let's steal his bottles. See, in those days, we didn't have plastic packaging for carbonated drinks. It was all in glass bottles, recyclable, very earth-friendly green bottles. I don't know why that's been dropped. So what Coke did was that it basically caught hold of Ramesh Chauhan's bottlers and bought the old Thums Up bottles of the bulk and would just put them away in a warehouse. So they didn't come back into circulation. So what happened was that Ramesh Chauhan was able to produce his Thums Up in vast quantities, but he wasn't able to package it and put it into the market because he didn't have enough bottles. And there wasn't enough glass making capacity to, generate the bottles required for him after Coke kept pinching his bottles, So I think he decided that, there was no point in continuing this fight. And at some point, I think he just decided to sell. And as it so happened, I think coincidentally it happened to be around when that decision was taken. So,
Yeah, tell us that story.
yeah, that's very interesting. So these negotiations with Parle were happening very hush hush in Delhi. Parle was headquartered in Bombay, and the Bombay journalists were sort of tracking this. But this was happening in Delhi in the Taj Mansingh Hotel. I had gone to the Taj, which was one of the handful of five-star venues available at that time. So I had gone there for some press conference or something like that. And I had run into the one general, Delhi is full of these liaison agents, basically deal brokers who do everything. Yeah, who do everything, all kinds of fixing they do, government tender, arms deals, whatever.
And they're all over the place.
Yeah. One of these guys was having coffee in the lounge, whom I knew. So I went to say hello. He said, better, have a coffee. And we were sitting and chatting. Then I actually had my back, to the doorway. So So this guy suddenly said, देखो, Ramesh खूब सारा पैसे लेके जा रहा है. So I turn around, I see Ramesh Chauhan leaving. I said, what do you mean खूब सारा पैसा? अरे वो he sold his company to Coke. That's what I hear. Or he's going to sell. I'm sure, I think they finalized the deal because वो खुश लग रहा है. He's looking happy. And one had heard some rumors about this because, Coke was this thing, but it wasn't, nothing was sure. But when this guy said, okay, I said, so I ran after Ramesh Chauhan. Now, Ramesh Chauhan got into his car and buzzed off. He had a house in South Delhi. So I leapt into my laboratory and I chased him behind that. I went all the way to the house. And those days, one didn't have so many security worries. So even rich people didn't have guards and dogs and all that. So I walked into the house and Ramesh had just sort of plunked himself down in the drawing room and he had these French windows. It is garden in the compound there. So looking out of the thing outside, I sort of peered through the French window and knocked on it. So he said, what the hell are you doing here? So who are you? So I said, I'm from Times of India. And I said, I heard that you sort of sold your company to Coke. So instead of denying it, he said, who told you that? So which I knew was a confirmation. Then he tried to deny it. I said, I knew, ho gaya, malum hai sabko, everybody knows this thing. Just tell me how much. So I won't tell you this, that, but, eventually admitted that he had indeed done a deal. So he didn't give me the deal amount, which came out much later, much later in disclosures. But at that time, the rumored enterprise value was about $100 million, which was an enormous sum of money. I think I speculated on that amount. I think the actual deal amount what Ramesh Chauhan got was $40 million, right? Which is still India's largest M&A deal at that time of any kind. So that happened, so it was sort of a serendipitous break. And so a lot of reporting is also about just being in the right place at the right time.
For us journalists, yeah. For people like George Fernandez and several other politicians, bureaucrats who fear MNCs and fear markets, was Ramesh Chauhan selling out to Coca-Cola a confirmation of their fears? How should we see this?
I don't think so. I think, but in a sense that, it seemed to sort of indicate that over the long term, Indian capital would not be able to fight global or Western capital. This was very much the precise, but mind you, this was around the same time that the Bombay Club was very active. If you remember that happened post reforms. There were many of the leading industrial houses of the country got together to lobby the government to disallow overseas investors from taking over Indian companies. They said, this, look, if you allow this, then there will be a flood, there will be no Indian company left, and then all the capital will flow back to the city, will get exploited, it is a recolonization. That was the thrust of the Bombay Club argument. So this was very much in that context. But I think the government had realized that, and particularly because the reforms process had been initiated. And I think people like Manmohan Singh and the then Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and Chidambaram was the Commerce Minister at that time. They were very pragmatic people. And they realized that, look, if we do need to achieve a much higher growth trajectory, we cannot do it with following the old policies. And if it means overseas investors, coming in, whether setting up greenfield or buying out and brownfield stuff, it doesn't matter. As long as growth happens, it's good for the country. And we can always put some conditions on ensuring that a lot of the money stays in the country. So, so we still don't have, for instance, capital account convertibility even now, after all so many decades. So they can't just up sticks and leave overnight and create a crisis like it happened in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, where this was allowed very early in the stage of development. And so I think, there was a realization at the very top that you needed foreign investment and foreign capital and technology to achieve the kind of growth that the country wanted. There was still a very much a socialist overhang in terms of what would be preferred stuff. So colas were not certainly preferred investment. junk food and cola. They were not. They wanted high technology, manufacturing, know-how, that kind of stuff. But, you can't have too fine a sieve in policy. Either you let everything through or you let nothing through. It's very difficult to sort of do it because they did earlier also. We always allowed foreign investment on a case by case basis since the 50s, but that didn't get the kind of returns that was required. So that's why they said reform meant opening that up, taking away that case by case discretionary decision making, saying, look, I mean, this is in this sector, you can invest 30%, 25%, 55%, 100%, whatever it is. And that sort of more or less continues even now, where we have a few restricted sectors where government approval is needed for certain levels of investment or above.
In fact, I think this also shows that Coca-Cola and Pepsi have had to reinvest their earnings in India to expand. So, they've been investing in India, creating jobs, creating markets. But also, all of the Indian competitors, I mean, Ramesh Chauhan is not making Thums Up anymore. But Ramesh Chauhan's company has done very well with the money that he got from Coke. Distillery remains a very important brand. And other than the government's Double Seven, the other brands are slowly resurfacing because even Campa now is going to resurface probably because, I mean, ultimately, the only failure was when government tried to make a cola.
Yes, I think that's a sort of a general lesson that government really shouldn't be doing certain kinds of business. Perhaps, I don't know, I'm just speculating here that maybe this was one of the learnings eventually which led to the government saying, okay, we will disinvest and divest in certain areas, disinvest in certain others where we will still retain a share, but we will let the private. So the government earlier had that finger in everything. They ran hotels, restaurants, they made cola, they made bread, they made everything, they tried everything, it was inefficient. I mean, telecom, the same story was repeated. The government controlled everything. Eventually, they allowed entry of, private players, mobile telephony happened, and, the rest is history. So I think this was maybe one of the lessons that maybe went home somewhere.
But did it? Because, and that's one of the reasons to have this discussion also now. One of the reasons government has returned to the business of at least selling packaged food when, under its own brands. There is Bharat Atta, there is Bharat Dal. Did the bureaucracy and the politicians learn these lessons?
Well, I don't know because the Bharat, of course, the branded rice, atta, and dal is an attempt with a different objective, not really to get into that market, but to try and control inflation by having a low priced alternative available to consumers. And it was a recognition that, the public distribution system alone wasn't enough to combat this inflation. You needed to reach a vast bulk of consumers who were listening, and that the market had already got packaged and branded, right? Even for staples. So it's no longer the old fashion, even in a Kirana store earlier. I remember when I was a kid, it was just deep rows of open sacks with commodities lying in them. And you just, weighed out how much you needed and took it home. But now everything is packaged in standardized measure. There is a brand of some sort, well known, little known, unknown, doesn't matter, but it is branded. So I think the government also realized that, in order to reach the consumer, it needed to package. And once you package it, you have some kind of brand on it. So I don't think it comes under the same category as that. But like all government efforts, it's not working very well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's confirmation that the market isn't working for the low cost segment in the market. The market isn't able to cater to that segment of the market, and therefore there is a need for government to have not only subsidize, in fact, free food through the PDS, but also a subsidized version of packaged food grains. So, if the market was functioning well, there wouldn't be the need for this. So instead of focusing on making the market work well, they feel they can be one of the players in the market. And this is how it starts. This is how Double Seven thinks that they can play the role that the market is not playing.
it's not an invalid argument to make for the government to be a player in certain areas to, if nothing else, act as a price regulator or a price indicator. And then people can decide based on that whether they want to pay the price or they prefer to pay a higher price or better quality of service or both. Then it becomes a market choice. So that argument for government's presence in certain important sectors, food is an important sector, telecom, I feel, is an important sector. It's now a basic necessity like food, water, electricity, communications is the fourth now. Even in housing, there is a case to be made for affordable housing, government built housing, which acts as a sort of price regulator. Otherwise, rampant private sector, this thing always leads to sort of, price inflation. And you have this case of huge demand and unsold inventory coexisting together because the price is unaffordable. So in certain sectors, that logic of the government being present as a player still works as far as I'm concerned. The problem comes in execution, whether it's able to do it well, whether it is able to match in quality of service or quality of product, which is why, the Delhi Development Authority, for instance, has an unsold inventory of some 2 lakh houses. Because they're shoddy, they cost too much, they're meant for the poor, but the poor don't want them because it's too expensive for them at the quality that they give and the locations that they offer, which are too far away. So they're not able to sell. So quality, BSNL Limited is not the first choice telecom provider for anybody, right? They're still the only guys available with connectivity in many areas still, so they're still sort of going along there. So all these issues are there. It's India wrinkles,
In fact, I would say the reason the market is not able to produce or supply goods and services at affordable cost sometimes or to the affordable segment of the market is again because some of their inputs are determined and are the pricing of that inputs is the cost of that inputs is an outcome of government policy, which again government does not handle well. So for instance, coming back to Bharat Atta, it is because of the rigidities built into the markets between farmers and companies that package food grains that raises their costs more than what government is, because government is able to beat down the MSP by offloading from their stocks. So their cost, turns out to be less. Sometimes, in fact, in the last 2 years, we've seen that government is making rules which forbids private players from even buying in large quantities from farmers. So the market is actually settling at a higher cost or a higher price because policy is doing that. So instead of reducing inflation through that route, governments choose to introduce,
basically, every time the government has tried to intervene in the market process with all noble intentions, what it has ended up doing is introduce additional friction. And additional friction means additional cost. Somebody makes money out of it. There are people who in the mid who are making the money, but the endpoints don't gain. So the producer, in this case, the farmer, his gate prices don't go up. And the consumer, which could be a bulk buyer, corporate buyer, or an individual buyer, their prices keep going up. So both are losers. In the middle, somebody is making money. And the reason these guys are able to make money is because of friction and restriction introduced by government policy. So that's been the problem in our country.
because the market does not allow to function in the way it would naturally, even in something like food. I mean, because of the large number of buyers, large number of sellers, there is no reason. There are many rigidities. You can't transport overnight food grains from one part of the country. There are a whole lot of problems, but still, markets could function a lot better.
It's true. And where markets function, market preference gets transmitted very, very quickly. And I think this whole cola industry is a very good example of that. So, if you look at what happened, so Coke comes back 1993, whatever they buy out Ramesh Chauhan. Ramesh Chauhan decides there's no point fighting them. So he just keeps the water business, sells everything. The first thing Coke did was to kill off the local brands. So they killed off Thums Up, they killed off Limca, and they killed off Gold Spot. All right, the 3 brands that, and one very weird one, a drink called Rimzim, which is a Jira drink. So they kill all of them off. Pepsi did the same thing, by the way, when they bought a much smaller, but Bombay people would remember a brand called Duke's. And Duke's Cola, Duke's ice cream soda, and Duke's Mangola were iconic in Bombay, right? And Pepsi eventually, it was a Parsi company, and I think the owner died or something like that. And so Pepsi just bought them over, and they killed off the brands. And even today, it's lamented. You go to a Parsi wedding, and they'll all lament the passing of Duke. That whatever that sliced mango which Pepsi offers is not considered a substitute, right? So in the cola side, with Coke also something similar happened. They killed off the brand, but what happened was Pepsi kept getting market share, but not Coke. They didn't like it. They'd already, as I said, foreign peanut or Pepsi. By that time, Pepsi was more familiar. It was there for 6 or 7 years. There was a whole generation of consumers which had come, which had never seen Coke because Coke had existed before that. So then Coke was forced to bring back Thums Up and Limca, right? Because the lemon category, lemon flavor was very big in India because it's a hot country and people have traditionally associated, Nimbu Pani as the refresher for hot weather. So the lemon category was very big. So they were, and their own lemon was Fanta lemon or whatever, wasn't working. Their lemon brands were not working. So there are two lemon, one cloudy lemon drink called Limca and a clear lemon called Citra. So they killed all the brands. But eventually they were forced to bring back Thums Up and Limca. And even today, Coke bought Parle in 93. And so it's now 30 years plus. Thums Up is still their largest seller in the country. Limca is $1 billion brand for Coke. Gold Spot, unfortunately, was never revived. I personally liked it. And Fanta is a struggler, right? Then they say, Fanta never took off. When I was in school, Fanta was introduced. I remember this was in the early 70s. So if you collected a Coke bottle cap, and gave it to the shop, they gave you a free Fanta. That's how I got hooked on the Fanta. I still have it. If I go abroad, I ask for a Fanta. And that taste was set very early in life. But, Fanta struggled. But, it's Indian brands which eventually, sold. You take something like McDonald's, right? McDonald's came into India, but they were forced to offer vegetarian options. And eventually the McAloo Tikki burger was born. So they had to innovate the local taste. All these global brands have had to sort of adjust to the demands of the Indian customer. And those who've done so have reaped the benefits also. They're doing well. So in that sense, the market sort of ends up teaching lessons which government can't.
Yeah, including to MNC. So Nirlas does not have a chole bhature pizza, but all of the, I think the KFCs, or which is Pizza Hut, I'm told has a chole bhature flavor of the pizza. So
yeah, they have that, and they've been forced to introduce wraps because Indians are more comfortable with something wrapped around like a roti. So what Pizza Hut and Domino's are wraps.
I don't know if it should be called a fake pizza or a fake chole bhature. But yeah, the market actually sort of teaches everybody, I suppose.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much.
I had no clue before Srini sir told me about it that the government made and sold a Cola 777. Politicians always find an excuse for increasing their own role in the functioning of markets. The latest example of this is Bharat Atta and Bharat Dal. The excuse this time is inflation. It seems very noble that government is selling food at below market price to cool prices for the poor. But the fact is that prices are high precisely because government distorts farm markets in all sorts of ways, raising costs for private players and obstructing market competition. The default response of Indian politicians for any problem is to take matters into their own hands, increasing their own control and influence over how the economy works. This time, it isn't left-leaning politicians that have done this.
You've been listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Pooja Mehra. Do stay connected with more of our coverage at the core. You can check out our website or sign up to our newsletter at www.thecore.in. That is www.thecore.in. Do also track us on LinkedIn, where we usually post synopses or extracts of our top stories and interviews. We would love your feedback, so do write to us at feedback@thecore.in. Thank you for listening.